watching the reaction from fans and other pros towards the player JW from Fnatic has brought up some interesting situations in terms of how people are perceived or how people are treated in the community. And it particularly brought up a classic example I thought of in the past. So I'll just set the stage for who JW is. So he's one of the top 5 players in the world right now. He can dominate entire halves, entire maps by himself on LAN, in the big finals, in semi-finals. He's someone who can hit, some of the most difficult, skillful, most unlikely shots in the entire game. His playing style is exciting, it's explosive, it's unpredictable. He plays on a team that's won 5 of the last 7 offline tournaments, including numerous international LAN events. And he's done all of this, he is all of these things, and yet he's only 19 years old. So you would think to yourself, okay, all those good qualities, all those great things going for him, he's only 19. Well, he must be universally loved, right? A young superstar in his prime, a guy who's got all these good factors going for him. He must be loved by fans, he must be respected by opponents, should be universally one of the faces of the game, right? But no, he's not. Some people like him, some people think he's okay, but actually quite a large portion of the community mocks him. They insult him with names, talk about his appearance all the time, talk about trying to suggest that he's lame or he sucks, or it doesn't matter if he wins in a certain way because of X, Y, and Z, it's unfair, it's bullshit, whatever. Other pros, other people he plays against, people even who he beats, some of them suggest who cares, it's just JW, he's bullshit, he's what, they deride him, they write his achievements off. And yet, it's not that this is happening to all other players. If there are other players who are great who had all those qualities going there, most of them would be universally loved. They would have all these great factors going for them. I know players who are much worse and don't have a lot of those qualities, but people make out like they're better players than they are just because their personality is loved. And it's not even a reference point that you can say, well, yeah, but I can see where people do make points about his appearance. No, that's definitely amplified and emphasized on the basis of whether people like the person. Yeah, there are some people who will joke about Freeberg's appearance, okay? But look at Freeberg and look at JW. If they both were treated identically, the amount of abuse you would see about Freeberg would be ridiculous. And by the way, abuse for either of them isn't right. It's one thing to make a joke and just make a passing joke. And if it's a funny joke, okay, fair enough, whatever. But people directly contact the guy and say abusive things, or they just make every comment, like 100 comments about it. It just goes too far. And so why don't fans like JW, despite all those good qualities I just described there in terms of a young sports star? Well, first of all, they don't like what they perceive to be his attitude. Now, most of these people I've noticed who say they don't like his attitude don't really seem to know much about his attitude, haven't really looked into the matter. So they have a really strong opinion based on a very small data set. That in itself is a flaw in analysis. Forget everything else, forget every piece of evidence. You don't make super strong conclusions based on very little evidence. When you have very little evidence, are you ready? You make appropriate assumptions based on that. So how strong should they be? Very little. Should be quite weak actually, because you've only got a little bit of data. So you can say something off that data, but then you have to say, I have to leave a lot of room until I get more information. Mostly, people seem to dislike him first and foremost if they've seen that DreamHack Bucharest video where Fnatic doesn't shake hands and then they say things in Swedish and they're angry with Nip. First of all, because there's a lot of fucking Nip fanboys in this game, so if you do anything that is against Nip in any way or perceived that way, you're treated like you're like the Nazis in World War II, and then the Nip fans are the allies, the good guys, as though that's even a plausible premise. But regardless of that, first of all, that incident is totally overblown. If you actually know the context behind it, and the fact that the majority of those players were actually really young guys, still early on in competition, in the context of beating Nip and then being told, oh no, you have to play again, and then beating them a second time, and the way Nip, if you know about the way Nip complains about certain things, they don't always do it in the most gracious way. Even in that particular case, Nip was actually correct in terms of the way the rules should have been interpreted, and they were right, and Fnatic was wrong to be so unnecessarily aggressive about it. I can understand if you've ever seen the way disputes go on between teams when it's with admins. First of all, if you're the star team, you tend to get to carry a lot of favour with the admins, and so there were all these factors going in there that would make the Fnatic team frustrated. And so even at the time, I didn't know any of them, but I understood what was going on there. And yeah, you probably do have to learn, if you're going to be those sorts of guys, a different way to do things in that way. You can't do that when you're going to be filmed, for example. You can see what happened now. But people have definitely gone way too far with that. And that shit happened in 2013. It's over 1 year later, and people are still bringing it up as though that was like a video that happened every single day of their lives. They were like, blah, 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 blah. You saw them do that once in one situation that most of you didn't understand the context of. Secondly, people think that other players in Fnatic cheat. Now, why the fuck that would be JW's fault, I have no idea, because he's not doing it. If they do cheat, they could definitely do it in a way that he wouldn't be able to find out about. And he's clearly a very good player who, as far as we know, we have zero evidence actually cheats right now or in the last 2 years or whatever. So it's really not his fault if he cheats. So the idea that you tar him with that feather and say, oh, well, if his teammate cheats, then he's a piece of shit too. No, it doesn't work that way. In fact, that's one of the ways you can tell how totally irrational and actually quite douchey most of the people who hate Fnatic because they think they cheat are. Because they don't just say, oh, I hate player X because I think he cheats. They say, Fnatic are cheaters, and as an organisation they're a piece of shit. They could kill them all and chuck them all out, and if they let any of them represent them, then they all deserve the same. Like, nah, none of those things are actually moral, mate. Those aren't ethical as statements. You're worse. You're doing something bad yourself by being a piece of shit like that. They also, thirdly, hate them for the Fnatic overpass boost, because again, that got dragged in with all these implications that it was like immoral, like, oh, you knew that was wrong but you did it anyway, and you just cheats and you're unfair and all the rest of it. Who the fuck knows what role JW had in that? We still haven't got to the bottom of a lot of that stuff. Okay, some people might not like that, that's one thing. Again, one half of one game. In terms of pros, now why wouldn't other pros like JW? Well, first and foremost, and let's be absolutely clear about this, they don't like him because he's good. And what I mean by that is, if he was total shit and was the worst pro in the whole scene, they would almost never comment on him. It wouldn't even be a big deal at all. But the real reason why pros always have disliked him, I can understand it on this level. When he first started out in CSGO, and first of all, there were some implications that maybe he cheated, and there was like a small amount of evidence that people could have taken that as their analysis of or conclusion that, oh, he cheats. If you thought he cheated, okay, you could be skeptical, or you could be like, oh, this guy's killing me all the time online. Like, maybe he's like bullshit offline, therefore he's just an onliner. You can write him off like that, or you can say, well, maybe he just cheats. Okay, that's one thing. That's one thing to be annoyed about. But crucially, when he then became a good LAN player and started killing people, there were still players who would make comments, or they'd be kind of douchey, or you guys don't get to see it, but behind the scenes, I would talk to some of them, and then I'd be talking about JW, and then they'd say like, oh, he's just bullshit. And I'd be like, he's better than you, and like everyone in your team, he's one of the best players in the world. They'd be like, yeah, but that style, it's just too random. It's annoying. It's just bullshit. Like, it shouldn't work. Like, first of all, I don't even know what the fuck that means. It shouldn't work. I know players who have like the perfect style. It doesn't work in a game. Luckily, we don't need to debate what should and shouldn't work. It happens in the game and it works. Therefore, in the game, it does work and it should work, because that's the way the fucking game works. It's a laboratory where we experiment what works, and it works. It's effective. I agree. I've sometimes said it shouldn't work, but as a metaphorical concept to explain that, the way we imagine Counter-Strike to be played, the core concepts, some of JW's ways of playing and decision making doesn't line up with that, but it does work clearly. I can also, by the way, totally empathise with some of those statements, like too random. It's true, his style of play is so impulsive, and if his team wasn't built around him in the way it is, and with those exact particular stars, like stable people like Flusher and Crims, obviously, and then having Olofem as like a potential guy who can just step up and get frags as well, if it wasn't like that, and if Pronox didn't give him the freedom, then actually his play would get punished a lot more than it is. He'd still be a very good player, he'd probably still be like top 15, top 10 in the world, but he wouldn't be as effective, wouldn't have as much of an impact. So when his team's based around him, almost emphasising how, like, the positives of that impulsive, random, unpredictable style, it means if you're an opponent and you get killed in that way, it's going to be really fucking frustrating. You're going to feel like, oh, what the fuck? Like, he shouldn't have been there. Like, oh, he shouldn't have killed me. I knew he was coming. Or, he just popped up out of nowhere for no reason. Like, what if he had done that 10 minutes later and I wasn't even there? Like, whatever. I can understand why that gets frustrating. That's the point. It's not legitimate as like that he's actually shit, but okay, it's a frustration. It's annoying. It definitely is annoying because he's so unpredictable, because he's so good. Crucially, it's fucking annoying to get killed and destroyed in those ways, because you don't know. You're playing against everyone else, and you have a lexicon of what should happen and what I should do next and what's the response. That doesn't work for JW. So if you're a pro, this is annoying. This is going to be you wish he didn't exist and that you're just playing everyone else. It's bullshit. Yeah, to some degree, some of it is bullshit. He does do a lot of crazy stuff that some of it is very lucky, or it's just so unlikely, or you would never be able to anticipate it, that it feels bullshit. I can get all that. But now that he's winning, now a lot of these pros should, and hopefully will, start to come around. You've seen it with a couple of people. I think you saw Pasha made a nice comment, said he was the best player in the world or something when Fnatic was winning everything. This is the point where pros, if they're going to be honest to themselves, should start to come around. It should start to be like, you know what, even if I thought all those things before, I've seen him play a ton of lands now. I've seen him be very good. He's got a good attitude now. Okay, he's better than me. He's better than most of my team. It's time to give respect. It's time to, you don't have to like the guy, but you have to give respect for his play and acknowledge that it's good, crucially, because it is. You can't deny that at this point. Any top level pro wants to deny that. Come see me, we'll have a debate and I'll win. In terms of this figure that he plays, well, I say like that, he's got everything going for him now, and there's now no reason people can hold back saying he's good and giving him due credit. It brings up a great example of a time this happened in the past, and what's going to make this a good example is that when I say this name, you're all going to think to yourselves, well, what are you talking about? That guy's one of the best players ever. Everyone knows that. Everyone respects him. Get Right was in exactly the position JW is right now, in terms of how a lot of the community viewed him, not in terms of like cheating accusations. No, he never had any of those things. But Get Right as a player, similar sort of age, by the way, actually a couple of years younger, probably 18 or 17. Back in like 2006, 2007, Get Right had already appeared on the scene. And he was playing in Swedish tournaments. He was in like the third or fourth best Swedish teams at the time. And sometimes they'd have upset wins and he'd have a big half. And his style was like very explosive style, like a lot of kills. And he finally got his chance to play in SK Gaming. Second best team at the time in Sweden, one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the whole world, filled with legendary names. Valle, Robban, Spawn was the person he was replacing, and they brought him in because they were trying to phase Spawn out because people didn't know what his motivation was anymore, and the team was having a few issues, so they thought, well, that's who we'll phase out. So they took out Spawn and they put Get Right in because they'd had Get Right signed as like a backup player for a while because he was a young talent. So they were thinking, well, as soon as one of our stars retires, we'll just bring Get Right in. So it was a good plan, actually. They bring Get Right in and they take him to the IEM2 finals, which was a major event. It was like a world championship level event. It's basically the IEM World Championship, but they didn't used to call it the World Championship back then. First season 2. They bring him in, and at this first tournament, he plays okay, actually. He doesn't play out of his skin like he did in some of the games in other teams, so he didn't play like a superstar. But he played okay, but the problem was the team didn't do that well. I think they finished like 4th or something overall. Overall, they were disappointed. Like, they never won the tournament. They were obviously hoping for, you bring him in, flesh blood, new approach, you'll win the whole tournament. Like, oh, it worked, yeah, and they bring him in for sure. So what happened was, immediately after the event, they just announced, like, yeah, we're not going to have him, actually. And they released him entirely from his contract, and they just brought Spawn back. And what happened was, around this sort of era, actually, maybe I'll keep going with it. So at the end of the year, next year, going into 2009, was when he got signed with Fnatic, and then they won everything that year almost. And from there on, his career basically is what you probably know it as now, one of the greatest players ever. Great star player, higher game impact, has his perfect role set, all the rest of that. But around this time, Get Right used to be mocked heavily, first of all by the community, who'd say he was like lame, fucking nerd. They'd talk about his appearance all the time. People who were other pros were all like, I guess he just chokes offline, or he's socially awkward, he's a retard, like, who cares about him, like, and I'll make fun of, like, yeah, how did you do at IEM2 finals, mate, ha ha ha, like, that's the way people acted. And they suggested that he was a try-hard, like, he wanted to be the best, he thought he could be the best, but lucky you, you're not the best, like, SK didn't even want you, like, you weren't good enough. Like, they reveled in the fact that he wasn't what he ambitiously wanted to be as a player. So what changed? Well, it didn't all change overnight. That's the thing. First of all, he joined Fnatic and they won almost everything that year. But then people could say, yeah, but you were playing with Gux and Forrest. Like, yeah, you're good, but Forrest is the best ever. And well, then the next year, he carried Fnatic. Now Forrest fell off big time in 2010, but Get Right elevated his level. He became even better. He became super consistent. He carried Fnatic. At the end of that year, him and Forrest left and they went to SK. In SK, he was even more so the carry. He was the star player. He was the guy winning these big games that sometimes they lost, big finals and semi-finals. He was the guy coming up huge and still keeping in there with 30 frags and a half or whatever. He was like playing heroic CS. It was really, really good. And crucially, when he went to SK, he had even more of the JW problems, because in SK, his role was shaped by how Robban saw his game. Robban, the in-game leader of SK, said to him, like, listen, you're going to be the son of a bitch in this team. Like, you're going to be the guy where people are going to hate you from the opposing team, because we're going to put you in this lurking role where you're going to play from behind all the time, you're going to play hidden in spots, you're not going to show, and I'm going to put you over here and the team's going to do this. And what you know now in CSGO is the get right style of play is what was developed in SK in terms of to the maximum. He'd always done a little bit sometimes, but it was only really defined as like, this will be your style now. And we've seen not only in SK was that very, very effective, like in SK and the latter Fnatic years. For me, he was the best Swedish player all those years, like 2 or 3 years in a row. And then he was one of the best players in CS history, for sure. You just didn't have enough years to become the Forrest Neo, you know. But going into CSGO, what happened in CSGO with that style? Well, first of all, he won like everything for the first 87 games. Then he's won tons of titles. He's won more top 4 finishes than any other player in history. He's been the star player of NIP in almost every single tournament, almost, for their entire careers. He's been one of the best players in the world for like 2 years in terms of like top 5 or whatever. It's only recently he dropped out, maybe like 2 or 3 months ago, that you could say he dropped out of the top 5 individual players. That's the level the guy got to. Absolutely incredible. Consistent performances over and over, beat every opponent practically, won everything, dominated individually. And so what happened? Well, a lot of those insults went away. People would, every now and then people would make some stupid joke, but it was never a big deal. There weren't interview things where people, like they did in the past, were just spamming loads of abusive things in nerd, tryhard, loser, all these sorts of shit. There weren't people who were other pros saying, constantly making those comments of like, he's just shit, he's fucking bullshit, even though that's actually how people used to talk about Get Right. They used to say these things like, his style's bullshit because he was doing that lurking style and he'd come from behind it, that shouldn't work, and why is it, he just plays randomly, he hasn't even got any skill, or he does it online but he wouldn't be good offline. All that stuff started to go away because he'd beaten them so many times and he'd done it without being a douche, that as a result eventually they had to come around because he'd humiliated, he'd put them in their place. He'd gotten to a place where eventually, if they did respect skill and they did respect being good players and all these things that they want respect for themselves and they think of themselves in this fair way, eventually they had to accord him his due credit and his deserts and give him respect and realise that if he's beaten me this many times, there's a reason why, and obviously his style must be valid. It's doing, it might be better than mine, more valid than mine, even if I play the right way and all that sort of shit. So hopefully this trend continues, and hopefully this is going to happen with JW. Like, I would think next year, roughly next year, maybe towards the end, would be when this should have kicked in. Like, if he's still doing well in Fnatic, if Fnatic's still a top team, it's going to have been longer since all the scandals and issues, which most of them in the latter days he hadn't got that much to do with. But particularly that Dream Up, of course, it's like a year and a half ago, something now at this point. Maybe like 16 months or something, but it's quite a long time ago. And in terms of the age that he was at, I mean, he would have been like, what, 18, 17 at the time? It's not that old. It's not that... It shouldn't change your whole life to have done that sort of thing once. So hopefully this trend can continue, and in JW we'll see a transformation like in terms of the public perception of Get Right, because people might not know it now, but he went through a lot of these problems and they were kind of undeserved. Like, yeah, I can understand some of the frustrations, like I've outlined there. I can relate slightly. I'll put myself in the person's position who's annoyed, but eventually you have to get over it and be reasonable in terms of how you think of other players, etc., and you can't just write them off in this particular fashion.